All right, and we are back. Drive Safe Dave here, back on BCB Live, the safest station in the nation. And I have with us a great guest here, Zach Miller, head of Stream. Why don't you tell us what Stream is?
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you so much for having me. And just everything you said at the open about truck parking and the ridiculousness of the Rhode Island only tolling scheme is just spot on. So I'm really excited to be here. TruckTractorTrailer.com is a two-sided marketplace where buyers and sellers can list their used trucks and trailers. We really designed it to serve the owner operator, to be a one-stop shop for that owner operator. But with the pandemic, with some of the changes we've actually seen more small and mid-sized, both fleets and dealers, utilize both sides of the platform. A lot of listings on the website, and then some of them using us to purchase as well, given the OEM supply chain problems. So Stream is the in-house media channel of TruckTractorTrailer.com. So that's where we have guests. We discuss news and views. It's a little bit of education, a little bit of entertainment. I like to say on Stream, a pun is always intended, and you can check us out on YouTube. That's Stream with three T's.
So, and I'm, yeah, absolutely. And go on, and look for them, find out about Stream. But really, I think what I wanted to talk to you about, Dak, today was here it is, and this is my favorite. You currently live in the big city of New York, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you are an advocate for drivers in the city. I mean,
Absolutely.
to me, that's a small niche. I mean, I mean, right? Would you agree? That's a pretty small niche in the city.
It's a conference of one, I would say, but no, but seriously, it is small, which is actually absurd because in New York City, about 90% of freight comes via truck. So we know that the majority of freight in this nation comes via truck, but in New York City, it's even higher. I mean, it's as close to 100% by truck as I think is actually possible to get because you'd never get 100% of anything in this world. So the fact that this city needs trucks to literally survive. And we just saw it during the pandemic, the absolute worst of it. The trucks were essential. They were treated as essential workers. They delivered everything that we needed. They completely shifted deliveries to homes and residential areas away from the major commercial corridors. And yet, despite all that, despite the fact that there are so many vehicles on the road in New York City in limited space, there are so many different road users, so that includes cyclists and pedestrians and public transit buses and all that. There are very limited incidents revolving trucks. Now they do happen, and when they happen, they do cause a lot of damage, and obviously that's something we'll speak to a little bit later in the show. But generally speaking, but considering the amount of freight trips daily, considering the amount of road users that truck drivers have to compete with. It is such an incredibly safe industry. They operate so safely, and yet they are vilified. They are treated like the bad guy, like some sort of like crazy movie villain. And I can't understand it. And it's just, if you hate trucks so much, stop buying things. Stop transacting. Go live in the wood. Go live in the woods. Be naked. Be starving and live in the woods. And you don't need a truck. And that's great and that's fair. But if you don't want to do that, if you do want to live in our modern society, if you do want to live in a major urban center like New York City, then you have to understand that a big part of commerce is going to be via trucking. And so instead of being a bomb thrower and painting the industry in a bad light, why don't you work together with the industry? The industry is always willing to come to the table, always willing to throw ideas around. And we could have really positive dialogues and try to come up with some safety measures and possibly some new modes of transportation that will work for everybody. But as long as the truck drivers and the industry as a whole is vilified to the extent that it is, I will always be on the opposite end, fighting for the truckers, fighting for this industry, and fighting for commerce. Really, at the end of the day, that's what it's about.
I agree with you 100%, especially in regards to the city. You know, most of the time, trucks, especially in that environment, it's already closed up. You become an obstacle. You become
Mm-hmm.
something in the way. You're either going too slow or you can't. I got to get around you. I can't see around you, and then you become something that makes it difficult for your day to be better. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why, because typically trucks are just, because if I have to stop, back into a hole,
Hmm.
and I got to block traffic, and I got it so I can unload the groceries that y'all need, you become this monster that you can't really push out of your way. I think sometimes people like to bully in the cities, like they honk. You're not really bullying a big truck, right? I mean, seriously, you're not going to do that. But I think it's important that both driver of the big truck and the other person on the other street user understand that this is a partnership out there on the road. And I don't care if you're walking, I don't care if
Hmm.
you're riding a bicycle, you're driving a cab. We're all partners using the same road. And if we don't respect one another, the bad things are going to ultimately happen to you. I mean, they will happen.
Completely. I completely agree. And that's something that, look, as you say, the truck, it's the bigger vehicle, it's the more powerful vehicle. The driver behind it is a trained, licensed professional. So the burden, for lack of a better word, of safety is always going to be greater on them, always. That being said, everybody does have to take a little bit of responsibility for their own safety. And the best way to do that is to understand where the truck is coming from, to understand the blind spots, to understand the turning radius, to understand that, if you can't make eye contact with the driver, assume they can't make contact with you. And understand what it takes to be a pedestrian around a large vehicle, to be a cyclist around a large vehicle, just as that driver needs to understand what it takes to be a driver around a pedestrian, to be a driver around a cyclist, to drive in a dense urban setting, very different from the open road highways. The driver needs to know that and understand that, and so too does the cyclist and pedestrian. And through that dialogue, through that mutual understanding and respect, we will really see an improvement in safety numbers and more livable streets here in these cities. And I think just better dialogue and better free flow of ideas, of commerce, of everything. And where I get so angry is that sort of education and outreach is sort of prevented here in New York City. The messaging has to be tough against trucks about how they're the only ones with responsibility. They're the only ones who everything enforcement needs to be against them. Roads need to be designed against them. And the more that message is out there, putting aside the trucks for a second, that kind of gives complacency to pedestrians and to cyclists to make it even harder for them to recognize things like blind spots and turning radiuses and making eye contact with the driver. And I can tell you, for me, I am a pedestrian. That's what I do. I do not have a car. I do not like biking. I've never felt comfortable on a bicycle. When I need to get around the city, I do it on using my own 2 feet. And just working with the trucking industry has made me such a better pedestrian. It's like night and day. And I could be aggressive as a pedestrian, like all native New Yorkers are.
Yeah.
Uh,
Y'all
J,
can
J,
be. Yeah.
jaywalking is a way of life here,
Yeah.
to be honest. And I do it. I jaywalk just like every other New Yorker. And guess what? I do it with an understanding and a respect of larger vehicles. And it has made me a better pedestrian and a safer pedestrian. And if there was more of that, we would live in a much safer city.
I look. We can split this off in many directions. Number one, I think sometimes people think because they're pedestrians and walking, they can stare at their phones and be oblivious to those things
Hmm.
that's going around them. They can be distracted walking. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't allow the driver behind the 18-wheeler driver be distracted with his cell phone and allow that or be tolerate that. But to walk and be distracted in a crosswalk, how is that any? How is that any
It's
better in a social setting in an urban area? How is jaywalking, staring at your phone, ever a good idea?
it's not. And putting aside the actual walking in the middle of the street, I mean, you could imagine how many people I see. They'll just walk into a pole. They'll walk to a light pole.
Yeah.
They'll walk into another person because they're looking at their phone. And I do think, you raise a great point, because I do think some of the terms we use for drivers we should also apply to pedestrian. Like when I talked about my becoming a better pedestrian, I look at it as defensive walking, as a defensive pedestrian.
100%.
It's the
100%.
same thing. Distracted driving, thankfully, we're making some changes to it, but distracted driving is a curse on this nation. it has ruined lives. It ruins
Absolutely.
lives by the day.
Yep.
We could even have a whole conversation about what the telecoms and apps liabilities need to be, because it really is a curse. But it's the same thing. You can be a distracted pedestrian. Of course you can. We've all done it. We've all
Yep.
seen it. So don't. Instead of siloing all these road users, we need to break down those walls. We need to look at everybody as a necessary and engaged stakeholder, and we need to be speaking the same language. And that goes to the responsibility. You have a responsibility when you're walking not to be looking at your phone, just like you have a responsibility when you're driving not to be looking at your phone. It sounds simple, and yet it's incredibly complicated.
It is complicated, and I think that's one of the reasons why we here at BCB continue to educate and talk about these things about safety, because even the pedestrian walking, they are responsible for their own personal safety. I mean, ultimately, we each of us are responsible, but I don't like that. I think we're responsible for safety. I think safety is everybody's business. It's everybody's responsibility, and you know what? Ultimately, I am responsible for other people's safety all the time. And drivers ultimately in a truck realize that, being a professional driver, because when has it not been the truck driver's fault whenever there's an accident, right? Because he's the trained professional. How is he in an accident and it not be his fault, right? I mean, but I truly believe that safety, number one, if you care about yourself or other people, that is fundamentally the first principle behind safety, right? Because you want to make sure other people don't get hurt, or you want to make sure you don't get hurt. I mean, that's what it is. And when you talk about engaging these people, I think we have to find a core value with them, a principle with them that spurs them to want to do that. Children are great at reacting and learning and educating because they're like sponges. They do soak up, but they're the first to run out in the street after a ball. So you got to be, you got to be careful. But I think education is important. How hard is it, and you mentioned it, to get people engaged in education when it comes to that kind of stuff?
It's funny you mentioned the kids being able to soak it up, because as we all know, kids love trucks, because it's trucks, dinosaurs, and superheroes, the three things that kids love. And so there are events. There are events where you could touch a truck, where you could get behind the wheel, where you could walk around and you talk to the driver, or a driver of the truck, and the kids kind of get it. They kind of get it. They understand. They know one of the things that they love about trucks is how big they are to begin with. So there's an understanding there. I think what happens is, as the person sort of gets older, that starts to shift a little bit. I think there's a lot. The negative media coverage definitely doesn't help anything. I think a lot of the political rhetoric doesn't help anything. And I think that's sort of what happens is, there's so much negativity that chips away at that
Right.
person as they get a little bit older, as they, become an adult and start really forming their own opinions, that all of a sudden that whole, hey, safety is everyone's responsibility. And the driver needs to make sure I get home safely, and I need to make sure the driver gets home safely
Correct.
without, not getting arrested or ruining their life. So it's just like, there's common ground there, or at least there ought to be. And so it becomes, I think, instead of talking over each other or at each other, we just need to talk with each other and just say, and I think the blind spot is the perfect one. You say, listen, it's there. I didn't design the vehicle. I didn't do it. I operate it as safely as I possibly can. This is a blind spot. Just please, you want to go to war with an OEM, be my guest. But for right now, this is how the vehicle is designed.
Absolutely.
Please do not walk or ride there. Please.
Yeah, because
At
I
the bare
can't see
minimum,
you.
do that.
Yeah, I
because
can't see
you.
you. And I'll tell you, and we mentioned this earlier in the pre-meeting. I've driven, and many drivers would agree with me. You go to these cities, and New York's an older city, and I don't care if it's Philly or New York or if it's Boston. I don't care. Some of the difficulties is these cities weren't designed for the size of tractors, trailers that we have out there today. They just weren't. designed for big 53s to swing a corner and to go in these areas. And you and I both know there's a lot of bridges that you just can't clear. They're low, and then the driver, if you're not familiar with the area, then shame on you. You know what I mean? Because
Yep.
now you're really the bad guy. But how hard is it to get infrastructure built and designed to help out with this stuff? Because I assure you that there are many bridges in areas that are really dilapidated and really dangerous in your city alone. I know several highways that should be absolutely fixed because they have large trucks running on them, and they really shouldn't be. Do you agree?
I totally agree. In fact, and that's where I'm going to go with that, because there's a major freight corridor in the whole Northeast, but it runs through New York City, which is the BQE, the Brooklyn Queens Expressway. That highway is falling apart, and it needs to be redone. And this is sort of where we run into problems in terms of New York City infrastructure, because there is a vocal group in New York and in a lot of urban areas that want highways completely eliminated. They want to go back to some of the racial history of highways, but also they really want to go back to the fact that they are anti-vehicle, any vehicle. So when you explain that this is a major freight corridor, they don't care. They think you could just shift freight to rail or to bar. Yeah, and which it's not like the railroads almost shut down the country 2 weeks ago. It's not. But sure, let's blame the trucks for the fact that we only have 2 rail companies in the whole nation. But this is the mentality we have to work with. So we were actually there was a large coalition of elected officials and community groups and business groups to get the funding to repair the BQE, to make sure that highway stayed that major freight corridor. And it was shot down by some loud local groups that want to turn it into a park or to some other sort of,
You know how necessary the BQE is? Do you know how necessary?
It's
I'm just
the
saying,
lifeblood.
do what now?
It's the lifeblood of the city, of the economy.
What would you do without it? I mean, but I'm going to tell you that I believe if you don't invest in it now, it won't be long before something tragic happens in that, because the alarm bells are already going off. Everyone knows that it is necessary to change it, and and we're not fixing it. I mean, how do we not fix it?
It's mind-boggling. They're doing some like Scotch tape type repairs, really, for lack of a better word, just to make sure it doesn't completely crumble until they could figure out what they want it to look like. But what it needs to look like, and I'm sure there are other. They could have it with freight and with something else. Doesn't necessarily just have to be trucks, but they have to have that corridor for trucks to go down. And to the point is, like you said, there are so many roads and bridges and communities already where trucks can't really fit through. But imagine diverting all of them off the BQE onto these local streets.
I can't.
Epic disaster.
I can't.
And that's what the understanding needs to be, and that's where the investments need. And then I think we could also have a conversation about places where you could do like micro distribution zones, where you could come up with ways to move freight from larger vehicles to smaller vehicles, possibly even cargo bikes, electric vans. There are opportunities there, but you have to be willing to meet with the industry at the table and talk through them, or else they're never going to happen, and everything is just going to get worse and worse and worse and less safe.
Well, what we don't need to have is a disaster, and because the alarm bells are out there, and I think what we're talking about, and I know the infrastructure bill was put out there, and I know that we've invested some money across the country, and if we hadn't, we would be in a much worse place than we are now. But I think not just the BQE is a good example of what we're talking about here. There's many things that we need to discuss if we wanted to, or go down that rabbit hole about how important it is when we do invest in our infrastructure that we think about trucks. I mean, we need to think about all of them. Look, most people don't realize the interstate system of the United States wasn't created for the four-wheel passenger car. It was actually created for interstate commerce. It was actually created to move goods and services across this country by, Dwight D. Eisenhower saw the need of being able for the defense, not only for the growth of the country, but for the defense of the country and for the ability to do that. And that was created, and it's turned into this, the interstate system is pretty awesome across the country. It's pretty effective. But we need to rethink and retool. I like the idea of sitting down with businesses and coming up with these micro centers. That's a discussion that business can succeed in. Mm-hmm. But if you're not willing to come to the table and just say, get rid of us as a whole, it won't work. I mean, it just won't work. I mean, and you don't want those trucks running by your schools constantly all day long like they do out in LA at the port, trying to get those, you know what I mean? We have those kinds of situations. And it's not beneficial to the public as a whole.
It's not.
I'll tell you what, it says here that you have gone to City Hall and testified. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. So, anytime that there's a bill that, generally it's through the Transportation Committee at the City Council, but there's a bill that's going to affect trucking, good, bad, or otherwise. The Trucking Association of New York comments, and I've been actively involved with that organization for a long time. I served on the board the last 4 years. I actually ran the Metro Region Legislative Affairs Committee for the last 6 years. So that's what I go to the City Council to talk about. And the most recent one was sort of what you were saying, where business takes the lead, but because the regulatory agencies operate a little slowly, the City Council wanted to give them a push. So the City Council really came up with this package of bills that would, for example, explore those micro distribution zones, that would sort of mandate that any new apartment building that goes up, that they have a dedicated space, for package delivery. Because of the rise of e-commerce, that on the street, anytime a building is go up and they take away a commercial loading zone, that during the construction, they must find a way to replace that loading zone. And so those are some of the more positive bills that the City Council looked to pass. Now, there are some negative ones that I had to testify in as well, things like, regulating side guards on every truck in the city. And of course, on the one hand, that's the thing, right? On the one hand, you say, well, it's a safety issue. And you say, but the city doesn't really have the jurisdiction to regulate it to the point where it would have any sort of safety impact. That's just an economic impact. If anything's going to be mandated in that way, it has to come at the federal level. New York City has no business just doing that. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you can see some of the fun I have at these city council meetings.
I'll tell you what, I do like the fact that you're an advocate and that you work with the Trucking Association. I think it's fantastic. I think anybody that's listening should be involved. If you're in this industry, you should be involved in your association. You should be involved at the local level, at the state level, or wherever you can get in. Absolutely. And as you speak to it, it's important that we all create that voice out there. Hey, Zach, look, man, I appreciate it. Why don't you tell us again about your site, what they can listen to, and how can they hear you?
So you could listen to me on Stream, which is YouTube. My name is Zach Miller. I am with TruckTractorTrailer.com, and you are listening to BCB Live, the safest station in the nation.
Wow, I didn't even have to prompt you, and you did it all the way through. That is awesome, Zach. Hey, listen, I'd love to have you back on to talk about some other fun and important stuff as safety. I appreciate you being on here, man. Great conversation, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend, sir.
Absolutely. You too, and I'm looking forward to coming back.